This episode of the podcast is dedicated to my friend Linda. She's no big fan of film noir, but she loves the Beiderbecke serials by Alan Plater. I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. To celebrate 40 years since the broadcast of the first of the Beiderbecke serials by Alan Plater, I'm joined by Dr. James Leggott, lecturer in film and television studies at the University of Northumbria. Currently working on a book about Plater, he recently provided the audio commentary for the Eureka release of Richard Lester's Juggernaut and published a monograph on Billy Elliot in the BFI Film Classics series. But today, we're here to talk about Plater, his wonderful TV work, his love of the jazz of Bix Beiderbecke, and much more besides. So, it's time to go up north. James, it's fantastic to have you here. We've been talking about this for a bit, and it's more or less the 40th anniversary of the original screening of The Beiderbecke Affair. So welcome to Tipping My Fedora.
Hello, good to be here.
And before we get stuck in, what's your definition of film noir?
So I wish you'd asked me this about 25, 30 years ago. Shall I tell you why?
Go on.
In fact, apologies, I'm going to give you a rather digressive answer here. So I did an English literature degree. So this would be in the mid to late 1990s. And one of the, actually, I don't know whether we called it then, whether it was a module, an option, an elective. Regardless, I chose to do a course on film noir. And I don't think at that time I'd actually seen many of what you might call classic film noirs. And it was, as you'd expect, it began with your classic stuff, Maltese Falcon, Big Sleep, and I think we proceeded through Kiss Me Deadly and the more paranoid stuff, right through to the 70s revisions, things like Chinatown and Night Moves and The Long Goodbye.
Fantastic.
Actually,
Yeah.
Night Moves, has anyone wanted to talk to you about Night Moves?
It hasn't happened yet, James, if you want to.
Right. That should happen. And then we would have looked at what would have been current in the mid-90s. The neo-noir stuff of Tarantino and David Lynch and The Usual Suspects and all those kind of things. So I reckon if you'd asked me then to define film noir in a succinct, clear way, I probably could have written you, with the arrogance of youth, a nice answer to that question, regardless of having probably fairly limited knowledge of those films. But as time's gone on, I've probably struggled with answering that question myself. I would have given you a lovely answer then, I'm sure, about the balance between iconography and narrative and tone and themes and all that kind of thing. But actually, this may anticipate your some of your future questions, because in a way, when I was studying film noir, I suppose, I mean, I am a university lecturer, so it's quite difficult for me to say this, but in a way, you can be, if you're schooled into something, there's different ways of being schooled, I suppose, and I suspect that my film noir module was my formal introduction to film noir, probably looking at the likes of Big Sleep and the Maltese Falcon for the first time. I dare say I may have caught a glimpse of them on the screen over, Christmas holidays or something like that, but I was probably new to them. And I was certainly new to the 70s films. I don't think I'd seen things like Chinatown before. But in a way, up until that point, I had been schooled, if you like, in a slightly different way, in that I'm pretty sure that growing up in the 80s and early 90s, as a young person getting interested in film and television, I would have been absorbing stuff about film noir in a different way through television, basically. And I don't just mean film screenings, like the sort of things which might have been shown on Moviedrome, for example, or Late Night Channel 4. I actually mean things like mainstream comedies, adverts, things which were spoofs, pastiches, parodies of film noir, even if I didn't understand them as such. So to give you an example of that, I was a huge Steve Martin fan. And I remember, just because I must have really liked Roxanne and some other films he'd been in. And I remember I either borrowed it or possibly taped it off TV. Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid.
Yeah.
Remember that film?
Oh,
And
yeah.
which is I don't really hear it talked about much, but it's a sort of Zelig-like thing where Steve Martin's sort of integrating himself into a fake noir detective story, and things like that. And Who Framed Roger Rabbit would have been on my radar, but also I reckon I learned a lot about the codes and conventions, not just of film noir, but all kinds of cinema, all kinds of filmmaking traditions from TV comedy. As a slight digression from that, I reckon that my introduction to the films of Ingmar Bergman was an extended pastiche of Bergman that I saw on French and Saunders. I don't know if this was the late 80s, early 90s, something
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
they did it felt like 10-minute piss take of what I later realised was Persona in particular,
Yeah.
but also a kind of generic thing with French and Saunders and some black and white hellscape, drinking meaningful cups of tea and screaming and sweating. And I would have, it was topsy turvy. And that probably when I eventually got round to watching those films, I would be like, oh, that's that thing from French and Saunders. Oh, right, I kind of get what that Scandi gloom is all about now because I saw them doing that extended spoof. And in a similar way, I reckon that by the time I got to university and was watching these films and reading, Foster Hirsch and R. Barton Pub, those writers
Yeah.
and reading about film noir, I was probably thinking, oh yeah, I've sort of seen this sort of thing. And one of the components, and this brings us to our example today, would have been the Beiderbecke TV shows, which in a gentle way may have introduced me to some of the names and tropes of film noir. Sorry, that's probably a very digressive answer to your question, but hopefully in keeping with the tone and feel of Alan Plater's writing, which is often digressive and not to the point.
So if there's one film you had to pick from the early period, then would it be sort of the neo-noir variety or the classic noir variety, and then that kind of grabbed you as a film?
That kind of grabbed you? Well, yeah. I mean, I think my interest was probably there from the likes of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which I would have seen at the cinema as an 9-year-old, 10-year-old, whenever it was. And certainly that Steve Martin film I mentioned probably got me thinking, what is this? What is this spoofing? I like it. I like the tone. I like the sensibility here, but I don't really know what it is. Fast forward to the university days, and as much as I enjoyed the Maltese Falcon and Big Sleep, I was actually impressed by the 70s stuff. I think the course I did, where we proceeded sequentially over a number of weeks, so the narrative was probably clear. But by the time I got to Night Moves and Chinatown, I think I was starting to get, okay, this is what this tradition is and what they're doing with it. And also at the time, in the mid-90s, in fact, I think my university essay on film noir, I wish I'd kept it because I can't quite remember what I wrote about, but I'm pretty certain that I did something on contemporary stuff, quite possibly David Lynch's Lost Highway, which I was rather taken by. And I wouldn't be surprised that I maybe a little bit pretentiously and ambitiously looked at that as a paranoid noir-esque film drawing upon doppelgangers and femme fatales and things like that. As I say, probably with the arrogance of thinking that I knew everything there was to be said about film noir. So, yeah.
You'll be glad to know that apart from the Maltese Falcon, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the one that comes up the most often on this podcast. So there you go.
I'm not surprised. I mean, as I say, there was probably a few entry points for those of us of a particular generation. And I was Googling to see if I'd forgotten anything, any sort of 80s, early 90s, particularly children's spoofs. And I came across something which I'm not entirely sure whether I have seen or not, but sounds as if I might have done. Do you remember the Garfield and Friends series after the cartoon Garfield? There was actually there's been different iterations in films since, but there was a TV show I was particularly taken with in the late 80s, and there was an episode of that. Oh, what's it called? Something like Babes and Bullets, a full-length Garfield film noir spoof, which I may have seen. I wish I had, and certainly I'd like to see it if I haven't, because it probably would be on a par with Who Framed Roger Rabbit. One of those sort of wonderful entry points into this whole thing.
Garfield would look good with a fedora. But okay, we digress no longer, or rather we now digress professionally. So, Beiderbecke Trilogy is what we're going to be focusing on. But how did you first get into Beiderbecke and its author, Alan Plater? And how did that come into your orbit?
Yes. So I wish I could tell you that I watched the Beiderbecke Affair in a particular time and place, and it grabbed me. And I developed a lifelong passion for the work of Alan Plater and for jazz music and for and for the world of that series.
I'm crushing on the inside already, James.
Yeah, but you know what? I can't remember. I remember vaguely, possibly either renting the videos or watching the repeats. And I know from what I can see that there was a repeat in 1993 on Channel 4. So that's that would be around the time I'm becoming more sentient and interested in sort of British television and film history. So that would figure. It's around that time when I'm having my hat blown off by other things. The Singing Detective, for example, which I would have caught at a repeat, not an original run, would have been young for that. Certainly things like Twin Peaks and Alan Bleasdale and stuff. I was discovering those in that kind of early 90s period. So I suspect what happened is I watched BEIDERBECKE Affair and the rest of the trilogy, and I think I quite enjoyed it. I think I recognised James Bolam. I found it quite sweet. I do have a recollection of finding it, and this sounds really odd in retrospect, quite dated. Watching it in 1993 and looking back to something made in 1985 seems a little bit ridiculous to say that now. But I think I remember thinking, this is a bit, this is not quite for me. But I think I've watched it subsequently many times, and its brilliance has been an acquired taste, and I've grown to love it. And it is, I mean, let's face it, it has a middle-aged quality to it, both in terms of
it's very mellow. Yes.
Yes, it's very mellow. And so it's not something which, as I say, had a big bang revelation to me where I can remember the first time I watched The Singing Detective and Twin Peaks, and I can sort of remember the armchair I was sitting in and how I clenched my cup of tea when watching them. But for BEIDERBECKE, less so. It's possible that I maybe watched the repeats, which I think Channel 4 showed them in all one go. I maybe drifted in and out and caught some and not others. I certainly engaged with it, but it's something which I would have returned to probably on the DVD release many years later. And I also developed a very slow burning interest in Alan Plater, as I say, with the kind of fire of a young person. The names for me were, as I say, David Lynch and Dennis Potter, and their experiments with genre and of course the detective form and noir were far more, seemingly more vibrant and attention grabbing, whereas the more humdrum charms of BEIDERBECKE and what Plater was doing is not the sort of thing which would appeal to a teenager, I don't think, or maybe an old soul perhaps or so. So it took me a while to figure out who Alan Plater was. In fact, I should say for listeners, shall I say a little bit about? Should I give him a little pocket summary?
Yeah, would you say a little bit more about the great Alan Plater?
Yeah, I'll try to say a little bit. Now, I should disclose at this point that I am trying to write a book on Alan Plater at the minute, which will be an academic survey of his career, which is incredibly prolific and very, very, very varied. So I'll try and give a succinct answer. So Plater, who's born 1935, he dies 2010, and he becomes a professional writer in the early 60s. And he's sometimes associated with that wave of 60s northern, maybe realist writers. He comes from Hull by way of Jarrow in Tyneside. He's not quite an angry young man, though. But in the early 60s, he becomes one of the core writers of Z-Cars, the groundbreaking police drama. I'm sure British listeners in particular will be familiar with it. But he's also doing Wednesday Plays and Play for Today. And actually, partly because he's involved for so long with Z-Cars and its spin-off Softly Softly and Softly Softly Task Force, which he's involved with for 10 years, he makes a real effort after that point to be as varied as possible in his work. So he's doing children's stuff. He does things for the Open University and for schools, television. He does adaptations of literary classics, contemporary classics, as well as his more individual stuff. He's doing sitcoms. He does an ITV sitcom called
Oh No, It's So Unfortunate. That's the first thing I ever saw by him, and I was utterly confounded. I was 8 years old, and I was watching this thing. I couldn't make head or tail of it. I did watch it every week.
It was huge in its time. I think it's one of those sitcoms which, I'm sure it's been repeated on some obscure channel, but it's not one of those things which is just like Dad's Army, which has been on a loop. But it was massive in its time, and it was huge with kids. It was a very family-friendly show about this sort of kind of village idiot sort of character who has adventures in this northern club committee world, quite niche in a way, but hugely popular. Alan Plater he didn't originate it. He inherited it from someone else, from Roy Clark, I think. But he ended up writing the first few series. So he's doing that. He also does he does a show for Les Dawson, which is quite noirish and quite obscure, but I thoroughly recommend it to listeners, called The Loner. It's only 3 episodes, and Les Dawson, famous rubber-faced comedian, plays this sort of morose, hard-boiled kind of character who drifts from his house on a hill and has a number of strange Plateresque adventures. So Plater's doing all of this. In the 80s, he gets a particular fame for adaptation of other people's work. A bit of a side hustle, which kind of becomes his main hustle, I think, as he struggles to get commissioning work in the more challenging landscape of 80s and 90s TV. So he's doing things like Fortunes of War, the Kenneth Branagh, Olivia Manning, a very British coup, for example, a more modern thing, a kind of fantasia of kind of contemporary politics. And he's also doing, which may be interesting to our listeners as well, he's also doing a number of crime and mystery things. So he does work for Miss Marple in the 80s, the Joan Hickson Miss Marple, for Michael Gambon. Sorry, not Michael Gambon. Who am I
Michael Gambon, Meg Ray.
Michael Gambon. Well, yes, he does the Sherlock Holmes stuff for
Jeremy Brett for
Jeremy Brett.
Yeah.
I did warn Sergio I was going to put up the IMDb so I could have it to reference, because I'm really terrible with the name of.
We can pause and you can do that, and our listeners will be none the wiser, James. Yeah.
It's fine. I can live with that. So he's continuing his career as a writer into the 90s, 2000s, and till his death in 2010. And towards the end, he's doing things like Lewis and Midsummer Murders. So it's an extraordinary 50-year trajectory, which goes from Z-Cars right through to Midsummer Murders, which I think must be unique within the British cultural landscape. But in the middle of all of that, there's Beiderbecke, which for many people is his masterwork, in the sense that it's probably the purest distillation of his idiosyncrasies, ideas, themes, and it's also a superb piece of writing. And so it's probably one of the most famous examples of his writing, and it's been available on video and DVD, and it's been repeated a few times. I'm not sure in terms of its reputation, it's probably not quite up there with, I don't know, The Singing Detective or Kathy Come Home, and those sort of top, the top flight canon of much discussed shows, but it's definitely up there. I think in those surveys of the most loved TV programs, it usually does respectably well, I think. So that's Plater in a nutshell.
I think that's marvelous. Yes, I mean, as you say, the issue with him is partly he's so prolific that you could just go on and on and on and talk about all these credits. I mean, I know I saw Oh No, It's Selwyn Froggatt in the 70s, but I don't think I knew who he was as a writer until I saw Fortunes of War, and then actually Campion, because he did the opening episode of Campion. And it's a very, very Alan Plater-esque opening, where he has Campion introduce himself seemingly to the audience, which is a lovely idea. And this very kind of deadpan, humorous intro, although it turns out he's actually rehearsing a speech he's going to give later in a mirror, which is very clever.
Albert Campion, born May the 20th, 1900. Name known to be a pseudonym. Education privileged. Embarked on adventurous career, 1929. Justice neatly executed. Nothing sordid. Deserving cases preferred. Police no object. Business address, 17 Bottle Street, Piccadilly, London, W1. Specialist in fairy stories.
My introduction to Plater, I think, was a slow one, where I kept on seeing his name against credits and said, oh, he's the guy who's done Barchester, and that's Fortunes of War, and Beiderbecke, obviously, and then filling in the blanks, and his name will pop up when you're watching Lewis or Midsummer Murders, and you're in for a secure and intelligent ride. In fact, it's telling that in the 80s, he was often the go-to person for launching a new series of Miss Marple. So I think he's there, and A Murder is Announced, which was it's been repeated on BBC4 as part of their
and it'll be on iPlayer now. Yeah.
And I know, speaking to some aficionados of of Sherlock Holmes and the Miss Marple TV series, they'll often point to the Plato adaptations as their favourite. The one they often say, "Oh, he gets it. He did make a big thing of wanting to do one of everything." So I think it was part of this kind of slightly restless spirit he had, but also this idea that he was also an honest craftsman as well. Actually, this is kind of relevant to Beiderbecke in a way. It's not for nothing that the two main characters that he pursues through those shows are a woodwork teacher and an English teacher, which I think pretty much encapsulates, and this was deliberate, Plato knew what he was doing. He was splitting aspects of his personality and his trade among those two characters, that he is the honest craftsman who can do something decent with wood. He can make a solid adaptation of the solitary cyclist or campion. And he would often talk about how he did different types of adaptations, one where the source material was excellent and already solid to begin with, others where maybe it wasn't so much. For example, A Very British Coup, I think everyone involved would say that Chris Mullins' novel was no literary masterpiece. Interesting. So he came at it, kind of made gold out of that. So he became, in some respects, better known for those adaptations than he did for his own self-devised work over the years. But as I say, in some respects, that was typical of the landscape of the 90s and 2000s, where I think his self-devised ideas, and I've looked in his archive, which is in the University of Hull, and there's files and files devoted to projects which didn't get off the ground. Shows which were going to be set in, allotments or more police dramas and things like that. And I know it's typical for many writers, but you can feel the disappointment, particularly in his correspondence around that time, that, taking on Midsummer Murders, not that I'm knocking it, but, that was,
Well,
it was a way, I suppose, likewise with Lewis. I mean, his work for those shows are great and very Plato-esque, but I think I probably would have liked more Beiderbecke, to be honest.
So would he, yeah. I mean, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I always love the fact in that interview with Sean Day-Lewis, he refers to the adaptation work as a solid piece of carpentry. And obviously that's great. Yeah. And obviously, as you say, goes right into to Beiderbecke. I mean, he did so much of that. And yet at the same time, he did a lot of original work, partly because he was so prolific, and whether it's work for radio, which he sort of went back to occasionally, and it's sort of where he started, and as well as some of the books that he published as well, although I learned a lot of them are technically novelizations of his own TV work. But I always found that if you actually look at the amount of original work he did, you've got the problem that long-running series are going to be better remembered because they're long-running series as opposed to all the kind of one-off dramas that he did. So the Land of Green Ginger, well, how many times is that going to get repeated? So you've got that problem as well with Z-Cars and Softly Task Force. He did, at least 15 episodes for each of those, virtually? I mean, that's a lot of scripts.
Yeah, and actually, he was very clear that his work for Z-Cars and Softly, which went on for 10 years, was a great way to play in this kind of sandpit. He gets the characters and the settings, and within that he's given freedom to produce. He used to talk about in the early days, in the 60s, he would just present his script and then it would be on screen a couple of weeks later, as opposed to the more laborious commissioner-led processes which he'll have later on. So it was a fantastic, I want to say nursery, but actually that's not, nursery slope is a little bit dismissive because his work for Z-Cars and Softly is fantastic. Okay, some of it's better than others, and of course a lot of it doesn't exist because a lot of it has been wiped, thank you BBC. So fortunately
we'll have no BBC bashing on this podcast, but inevitably in economies of scale. Yeah,
exactly.
What I was going to say is that I don't know if you're interested in him at all, but the writer I always think of, not because that you would compare him with Plato, but he's a contemporary of his who had a similar trajectory, is P.J. Hammond, Peter John Hammond, who of course kind of took over on Z-Cars as a kind of story editor and then became a sort of main writer for them. So he's a few years later than Plato, but he starts off on Z-Cars, ends up writing on a ton of shows, and ends up being basically like the main writer on Midsummer Murders. I think he wrote about 10 of these feature-length episodes. Has, of course, a couple of terrific credits that are all his own, which are, I mean, the most famous one being Sapphire and Steel, which is the most distinctive and the most personal. And I think he's still around, but he, had one of those long careers. But you don't remember him the way you remember Plater. He did all kinds of writing, but, I always see them almost in parallel. Like, well, he was doing a lot more of that kind of commercial, solid carpentry, whereas Plato was able to do a bit of that and a bit of his personal stuff until, I suppose the economics of British television just changed in the 80s and 90s. So in a way, Beiderbecke is almost on the cusp of that last gasp of kind of personal British telly of that type, of that era. Because, I mean, let's talk about that, the first of the Beiderbecke. Although we should say, I suppose, and I just wanted to get your opinion on this, Beiderbecke does in fact start with a previous serial.
Yes. So this is a show called Get Lost. I can't remember whether there's actually an exclamation mark at the end.
There is, yes.
Might write in Get Lost exclamation mark. Which it's very tempting to see this as the prototype or extended pilot for Beiderbecke, but it is essentially a self-contained 4-part drama. And actually its history is itself quite interesting, because Plater had been commissioned by Yorkshire Television, who he had a relationship then, to do an adaptation of J.B. Priestley's The Good Companions, which they wanted a 13-part adaptation of that. He'd previously done a similarly long adaptation of The Stars Look Down, I think a few years back, and around that time he was also doing a version of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which didn't happen. Yeah, and so he said, okay, yeah, I can do The Good Companions. However, I don't think we really need 13 episodes. Can we do 9? Tell you what, he says, I'll do 9 episodes, and can I have those 4 remaining fallow episodes from the budget to do my own thing? And what I really would like to do, in his words, is a non-violent thriller. So he had, if you look at some of his pitches and his initial ideas, he was very clear for Get Lost that he wanted to do a mystery detective thing, but without the kind of violence, and something which would have that very comic sensibility. And that's what you get in Get Lost, which is about a couple of school teachers, one a woodwork teacher, the other an English teacher, and they're played by Alan Armstrong and Bridget Turner. The Alan Armstrong character is called Neville Keaton, bear that in mind. And he is a rather shambolic, jazz-loving bachelor who gives lifts home to the English teacher Judy, and Judy's husband has gone missing in mysterious circumstances. He's left a videotape message, actually a Betamax message, which is amazing, saying that he's disappeared and doesn't want to be found. And then Judy goes off with Neville on an adventure to try and find out what happened to the missing husband. And along the way, they get involved they discover an operation that allows people to disappear from aspects of their life, people wanting to run away from difficult relationships or just have a change of scene. And they eventually find the missing husband, who's always had a yearning to, sorry for the spoilers here, but if anyone's watching it, but he's always had a yearning to work in a fish and chip shop on the East Yorkshire coast, which is where they found him. And that's basically it. So reading some of the pictures and early plans for the series by Plater, he's very clear that he wants it to be a kind of northern noir style show, adopting a noir idea of kind of passing around the perspective from character to character. And there's some specific, you get this a lot in Plater, you get, as well as references to music, football and comedy, you also get lots of film and literary references, and there are specific references in it to Alfred Hitchcock. In the very first episode, the Judy character pulls a book off the shelf with a picture of Hitchcock in it and makes reference to Hitchcock's idea that the police are always boring, which is a phrase later uttered by James Boland's character in Beiderbecke, so something very dear to Plater's heart, clearly. There's also a very specific reference to Philip Marlowe. Judy says of her school teacher friend that, he thinks he's Philip Marlowe. So the audience can't miss it. It was released on the network DVD release of the Beiderbecke trilogy a few years back, and I think hitherto had rather fallen into obscurity. And it's on. You can find it on YouTube as well. But it looks rather grainy. The print's not great. I don't know whether you've seen it, Sergio, but
Well, it's shot on video, not film.
it is, and it kind of has that look to it. It has a kind of rather grotty quality. There's a sequence where they go to an out-of-season caravan park on the East Yorkshire coast, and it's a different kinds of mean streets, I think.
But the problem with using outside broadcast technology at the time on video just wasn't as good, and that's why they tended to shoot that stuff on film. But it's entirely on tape, on location. But as you say, I think that the lighting does it no favors, and now it looks. It's a mean thing to say, but because obviously it's much better quality than that, but it almost looks like old VHS technology that you would have done almost with a camcorder, isn't it? It's frustrating.
Exactly so, and I think we're very, very warm towards it because it's actually showing us the origin story of the characters that we're going to grow to love and follow in Beiderbecke. It also has a device which you don't get in Beiderbecke, which is occasionally you get in a monologue from the characters, particularly the Alan Armstrong character, in a Philip Marlowe style, replete with the accent. So it's quite, as I say, it is quite. And there's some cute spoof stuff in it. There's a car chase at 10 miles per hour around a caravan park, which is good fun. So there's a lot of good stuff in it. And also the reference to the Thin Man is interesting because I think there's a sense of Plato maybe picking up something he's going to explore more in Beiderbecke. The easygoing relationship between the characters is something which we're going to find really appealing in Beiderbecke as well. So yeah, it feels a little bit grotty, but it does set up, because when we first meet the characters in Beiderbecke, I should explain the reason why Beiderbecke feels the same but different is that Plato had intended to write a sequel, a Get Lost 2 or Get Lost Revisited, whatever you might
Get
call it.
Lost Again, yes.
But Alan Armstrong was unavailable, so there was a decision made to reboot it. And I think for various reasons, this does energize the show. There is something about the James Bolam and Barbara Flynn energy which works, I think, more so than the Alan Armstrong, Bridget Turner. But judged on its own merits, Get Lost is okay, but it does feel like curtain raising for Beiderbecke.
And of course, Beiderbecke is shot on film, and in fact, I don't know if we've got time to discuss it, but it looks amazing. It's one of the great things shot on 16mm in this beautiful style, lots of languid, long, complicated takes, and it's got the same cameraman for all three of the serials, so it looks fantastic consistently no matter who the director is. And that's that great thing about TV at that time. They were prepared to do a 6-part serial, this kind of gentle comedy thriller, and it looks fantastic.
It does. I'd so love to see this, upscales, and to see it, Blu-ray release of this in a way that the Singing Detective. I don't know whether you caught that when.
Looks wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. You think you've seen it before until you've seen the restoration of it, and likewise with this. No, it does look good. And as you say, there's swooping camera shots, and of course, it's exploiting the wonderfully diverse scenery of Yorkshire. And you do get, particularly across the whole of the series, which ranges from the coastal areas to demolished areas.
Mind you, when you look at all this.
Yes, I know.
Has it got a name?
Redevelopment.
Where I come from, they're always doing this. In that funny place where the people say, how way and why you bugger man.
There's a lot of it about. Everywhere. Redevelopment.
If you get voted on the council, you'll want to do this kind of thing, will you?
Haven't you read my manifesto?
I only post them, I don't read them.
Quote, if I am elected, I will call a halt to the official vandalism and desecration that have been done to England's green and pleasant land.
You're too late, Pet.
It does look terrific, irrespective of the fact that, as you were saying, the environments, of course, are quite varied, and this is partly where some of the seriousness that underpins the gentle comedy starts to come through. Of course, the, shall we call it politely, urban redevelopment. Now we'd probably be talking about gentrification, probably, wouldn't we?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is at the heart of the tension, which not everybody liked. In fact, some contemporary reviewers were a bit baffled by this odd mixture of the gritty and the sweet. On the one hand, there is a certain reassuring quality, the sort of homespun quality to the characters and the setting, but it's shot through with some quite angry sentiments about social decay, particularly the later series about under-resourced schools. Well, should we dig into this and perhaps talk about
Yeah.
the plot? Because, well, I'd certainly encourage listeners to familiarise themselves with the entire series if they haven't done so. But the Beiderbecke Affair, the first series was 6 episodes long, so it proceeds at a lovely, languid, leisurely pace. And it sets up rather slowly a mystery of sorts, and it's a rather noirish one in that we now have Trevor Chaplin. I mentioned earlier that his predecessor was called Keaton in Get Lost. You could see what Plato did there. So Keaton is now Chaplin, and he's now in a steady relationship with Barbara Flynn's character Jill, and it begins with James Bolam's character, again, a jazz-loving, rather shambolic middle-aged man, who I think is clearly based on Plato himself. Plato noted how the costume designers had observed what he himself was wearing and put James Bolam in it, so there's definitely a self-portrait as such there. It begins with James Bolam getting a knock on the door, and it's a mysterious platinum blonde, which is funny because in the previous scene, the character has been admitting that that's one of his fantasies, that in a Chandler-esque way, his slightly humdrum life will be kick-started by the arrival of said blonde. And this plunges him into a bit of a mystery. The blonde actually is selling door-to-door from a catalogue, and that catalogue, rather oddly, includes the opportunity to buy some jazz records, and he takes up that option. The records arrive, but are the wrong ones, and this leads him on a trail to basically sort out his records. But before he knows it, he's exploring what we might call a kind of alternative economy, maybe not quite a black economy, which is overseen by the charismatic Big Al and Little Norm, who seem to be running via a church, through the basement of a church, a sort of kind of mail order catalogue. And that instigates the curiosity of the main characters, but also our new wet behind the ears policeman, who is called Hobson, which leads to a few references to Hobson's choice along the way, who he is a newfangled policeman with a degree and later a PhD, which is quite outrageous. And he is using the latest computer technology and data gathering to carry out surveillance on these strange subversives who he's discovering in Yorkshire. And that sets up the plot. And in some respects, it's kind of not about the plot, really. There are a few MacGuffins along the way. And where the plot eventually takes us is a whole web of corruption and dodgy dealings by what you might call an elite group of businessmen and councillors who have been, we realise, intimidating Trevor and Jill because of their seemingly seditious, radical actions, which also includes Jill's environmental campaigning. She's standing to be a Green candidate. So that's the plot, basically. But sometimes when I'm rewatching it, it's a bit like when you rewatch The Big Sleep. You think to yourself, it doesn't quite hang together, but it more or less does. You can kind of follow the threads through. And it comes to a more or less satisfactory climax where the villains get their comeuppance and everything is put right. So there is this kind of mixture of reassurance, but also, as we've mentioned there, Plato is throwing in some of his concerns you get in the rest of his work around the economy, around radicalism, and essentially what he's describing in the Beiderbecke Affair, rather subtly, is this attempt to crush the kind of spirit which Trevor and Jill represent in different ways. Trevor is, jazz-loving, slightly eccentric middle-aged man who just wants to get on with his life. Jill is exploring her environmental principles publicly. Either way, they represent something the establishment don't like.
No, and certainly not in the middle of the heart of Thatcher's Britain, after all.
We certainly get this kind of corporate Thatcherite boot coming down on both of them, and the alternative economic enterprise of Big Al and Little Norm, which we hear is all about because of the economic situation. We meet opportunists like the old fellow with the dog who wants to turn himself into a supergrass because it's a way of earning some money. So Plato has a lot of fun with the language of supergrass and surveillance, and so it has all of these kind of noir elements shot through.
And then we get sort of a conspiracy thriller type element. And of course, there's this whole business about meeting in the car park, which is particularly, I think, it's kind of all the president's men sort of noir, which is very funny.
It's full of direct references. I mean, there's specific references to Casablanca and Some Like It Hot, and musically to On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. And Jules et Jim as well.
Oh, right at the end, of course.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, we should say also, I mean, there is this fascinating element that is introduced fairly early on with this idea that Trevor is sort of become he's not exactly in a menage a trois, but there's this bizarre idea that his ex-fiancée turns up and she and Jill flip a coin for who's going to get him, which is very funny. But what I like about that is that, I mean, obviously, please go into it in more detail. But what I thought was so terrific was the way that we're getting a sense that the relationship between Trevor and Jill, they understand each other fairly well. But there are, she was married and is now divorced. And there's this tentative element to it. They live in, they stay, he stays at her place occasionally, but fundamentally it feels like they're together, but it's still slightly early stages. And one of the things that actually goes across the trilogy is how that changes, which I think is terrific. But also it's important, I think, that Trevor just a little bit has to sort of be a little bit bolder and a little bit stronger, so that final sort of element of the story, which we get when he gets to kind of the end of the serial, it's sort of him standing up for himself and for Jill and for what they believe in. And it's very forceful and very persuasive. And it's kind of a great moment, actually. And, on rewatching it, I thought, go for it, Trev. I'm with you.
It's time you liberated yourself, sweetheart.
Like you have.
Unless you're going to go on living off your old man's pieces of silver for the rest of your life.
My God, but you've changed.
Well, that's a general idea, isn't it? We grow up. Stuff like that.
I liked you better the way you were before.
You mean when I took orders without question?
Yes.
He's dead and buried, that lovable Geordie school teacher. This is the new dynamic Trevor Chaplin.
I don't like him.
That's up to you, but I'll tell you this for nothing. Nobody wins me at the toss of a coin. It may have worked in old money, but...
My mother will be very disappointed.
Why?
Well, she wanted to see you again. And she was up half the night with her stroganoff.
There you go. What's the use of money if you haven't got good health?
I'll see you.
Goodbye forever.
Yeah, in a way, it's as much about their developing relationship and with the conspiracy elements getting into the way of that and testing it really for them. And they have different tests of their relationship in all three of them. One thing I was struck by when watching it again is how sort of sexually overt it is, considering you're talking about, it's very clear that they have a comfortable sexual relationship, and that they also have a codependency, which is really sweet. And because you may say, well, what exactly is the appeal of James Boland's character? But as you say, he emboldens himself and becomes more kind of bold and proactive as it goes on, and you begin to see the appeal for someone like Jill. So no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think there's an autobiographical element as far as Plato goes, not just about aspects of his personality, but also, without getting into sort of perhaps some slightly scurrilous stuff, Plato himself remarries in the early 80s. He'd married early, I think, as a young man, and had kids, and then later separated. And around the time of the sort of early 80s, he was into his second marriage. He married two women called Shirley, and Shirley, his second wife, was his lifelong partner to the end. And he often talked about how Beiderbecke, whether knowingly or not, was him exploring the idea of him and his new partner having adventures, and looked at it in that light, the way in which they bring with them certain baggage, which are kind of resolved. The ex-partners turn up and whatever, but those sort of things are resolved quite amicably. So I think, there's definitely a personal element to that.
1985 is more or less the year when I think Plato moves to London, isn't it? I think in a way there's an interesting, not a nostalgia, but there's almost that sense that you're recreating, shall we say, the North a little bit, not from memory, but he's sort of willing it creatively into existence, because he's not living there anymore, and he's remarried, he's got a new life, and the fact is that the television industry was based in London in the southeast. So ultimately, instead of doing 30 trips a year to London, you go there and then you make as many trips as you can back up north. And so in a way, it almost coincides with that, doesn't it? Which is sort of a really intriguing aspect of it. That doesn't really come through, but there's an awful lot of really amusing riffs about just, other parts of the north, let alone the southeast or what have you. It's part of the joys of the serial is the endless kind of joshing.
Yes, and you've also got James Bolam as the exiled Geordie, which is similar to Plater's own status, because he regarded himself as having this double kinship, having been born in Jarrow in the northeast and moved as a young boy to Hull. He sort of had similar status and certainly aligned himself with representations of both those areas in his work. And James Bolam thus is a perfect amalgamation. So there's a lot of fun had about his Geordie ways. I think Big, I think it's in some of the later ones, Big Al often makes these sort of jokes about, you never trust a Geordie, but at least he's not a Londoner, which could be much worse. But yeah, you're certainly right. I mean, obviously it's a Yorkshire television production, and we might expect this, but there's a wonderful bit in right towards the end where Sergeant Hobson, who's been spending all the series trying to unlock the mysteries of what on earth is going on inside the heads of Trevor Chaplin and Jill and Big Al and Little Norm. And in fact, what is the quote? I have this here, where one thing defeats me, he says, the dark, impenetrable, tantalizing mystery, the psychology of Yorkshire. So this has been the mystery all along, right from the beginning, trying to make sense of God's own country, which is ultimately beyond him.
There's lots and lots of material in Beiderbecke Affair, and partly because they say it's 6 one-hour episodes or 52 minutes plus adverts. But there's actually a lot going on, although the tone and the tempo is quite leisurely, quite mellow, as we said. And yet, in actual fact, there is plenty of time. It's one of those productions from that period of British telly which are a sort of crossing over with the way you used to shoot studio stuff on tape, which were very discursive, very verbal, because it was done almost as live in essence. So you had huge blocks of tape, like 10 minutes, people talking, not at all unusual. And then you do a bit of outside broadcast, usually on 16mm film. But these are shot on film, and this is following on from the success really of Brideshead Revisited, and which ultimately will lead to Jewel in the Crown and then the Sherlock Holmes series with Jeremy Brett, which was shot entirely on film and look terrific as a result, but also made them much more saleable internationally. Now, the odds of Beiderbecke being sold internationally are probably a lot lower compared with those, but I do find it this wonderful kind of amalgam of styles. I think it works beautifully. But as I say, because of the look of it, and it's shot by this DP called Peter Jackson, not that one, who had a terrific TV career, and it looks sensational. You get these, and you realize just how much effort they must have gone into it, because just to have a shot where you see somebody getting into a car and then meet up with someone further up the road, and it's done in one elegant big camera crane, so that somebody leaves the front door, the camera goes above the roof of the house, and you see them re-meet up later, and you're thinking that must take forever to rehearse and shoot and get the timings right. And it was all worthwhile. It was all okay. This was a time when you could do that. That changed quite rapidly in the industry, and I suspect probably affected the sequel, didn't it?
Yes, that's right. I mean, absolutely so. I mean, that's one of its joys. And we can also talk about the music soundtrack as well, which is.
Well, we gotta talk about, yes, Frank Ricotti.
Well, Plato wouldn't like it because we've got thus far without really hearing the music. But even the score, the amount of detail has gone. There's occasional a bit of what you might call Mickey Mousing, where in some scenes the music sort of changes accordingly. In terms of where we go next, the series is a success, and so this leads to talk of a sequel. But there are delays, and these are chronicled quite well in Andrew Pixley's notes in the Beiderbecke set for Network, where he goes into the precise chronology of this. So I would suggest readers who are interested might want to look at that, as well as William Gallagher's excellent BFI book on Beiderbecke as well. So there's a lot of data out there to draw upon. So the what became the Beiderbecke tapes took a while to materialize. And in the meantime, Plater had novelized the Beiderbecke Affair, which was his first full-length adult book. He'd published a children's book before then, and some of his theatre work had been anthologized and so forth. But this was his first novel. And it ended up that the Beiderbecke Tapes, the sequel, which broadens the scope by having our heroes drawn into a story of environmental corruption and disinformation. And the Beiderbecke Tapes took a while to materialize, and such there were changes to what had happened in the novel, which saw its characters going on a school trip to Rotterdam and then to Athens. And in the TV version, they just go to Amsterdam, and Athens was replaced by Edinburgh at the insistence of Yorkshire TV, who felt this was far too expensive, sending off the cast and crew to the Acropolis wasn't going to happen. And maybe you can see there a bit of a tide turning, in the sense that the days of Plato being able to have full sway over the material diminishing a little bit. Also, significantly at this time, Plater is, I think it's around this time when he's becoming chair of the Writers' Guild, so he becomes a very prominent and public advocate for the role of the writer. And actually, if we're thinking about his public persona, maybe one of the reasons why he is quite well known is he would often crop up as a talking head. He would often write articles and letters to The Guardian bemoaning the lot of the television writer, and later on his critiques of some of the organisations he works for, including the BBC, become quite strident. So as we've spoken about, this really feels like capturing this period from the mid to late 80s to the early 90s. This is capturing a changing production climate, I think. But should we talk about the tapes? Did you enjoy the tapes, by the way?
I did like tapes. I mean, funnily enough, he said, I think tapes was actually the first one I saw. That's because I was living in the UK by then. I was here from 1977 to 81, but otherwise I'm from Italy, Roman through and through, born and bred, and my dad worked for an airline company, Alitalia, and so we moved here in 77, and then moved back in 81, and then moved to Singapore in the mid 80s. We were there for 5 years, but in the middle of that, I started going to university, and I was at London School of Economics studying law, and that would have been in 87 when I started there. So I think I saw Tapes and Fortunes of War around, within sort of a year of each other, I guess. And I like Tapes partly because it feels a bit more Thin Man-ish in some respect. I think it was always there, of course, but particularly sort of at the end of the first Thin Man film, there's the thing about Nora becoming pregnant and so on, and they're gonna have a baby, and I remember liking it. Now, obviously, this is one where it feels different because it went from being a 6-parter to really being a 4-parter that was shown in 2 slots. So it becomes 2 90-minute films instead of 4 1-hour films, and instead of 6 1-hour films. So it's a bit more compressed, and so I think it doesn't have quite as many of the characters and so on and so forth, and you spend less time with them. But I like Tapes. I always thought it was quite fun. I mean, it's quite fun. We've gone from an LP to a tape now. We've got that. The Bix Beiderbecke element is always there. Of course, it's wonderful jazz music. The music is by Frank Ricotti, channeling the Bix Beiderbecke recordings and era. And in fact, eventually, he will appear with his all-stars in the third one. So I'm a big jazz buff. So I'm a big fan of the music as well.
Actually, just on that point, you see, I've got to be honest here that when it comes to jazz, I don't really hear the music. And I think this Yeah.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I took, as I've mentioned already, I certainly would have picked up so much from Plater's writing, and I would have been interested if I was watching this in an impressionable age. I would have been interested in the noir references and the references to comedy. I'm not really a football person either, so I think those football references would have gone over.
I'm with you
Would
there.
have gone over my head. But in terms of hearing the music, my father was a big jazz fan, and I probably spent a bit of time. He would take me to jazz concerts in the hope that some of it would rub off, and I did my best, and I think I would always enjoy it for a few minutes, and then after about half an hour, I would think, can I have a tune now, please? But that's probably
So you're kind of with Jill, really.
Exactly. I think I'm on Jill's side.
You're Team Jill.
But in terms of being the musical aficionado, I do have lots of other musical obsessions which have followed me all my life. So I totally get the collecting mania and obsession and need to tell everyone the story of my musical passions to other people and to bend their ears with it. So all of that I truly get, but not so much the music. But just on that note, so in the Beiderbecke tapes, in terms of the plot, it's pretty slender. Trevor gets hold of some tapes of his beloved jazz. One of them happens to have voices talking about possible dumping of nuclear waste on the Yorkshire Dales, and this sets him on a quest to discover what's happening, and there's all kinds of double dealing and conspiracy theories, and eventually the revelation, actually these tapes are fake. It's all about disinformation being spread by some sort of shady government group. But in the meantime, there's also the trip to Amsterdam going on, which I suppose it maybe has a slight kind of, what you do. It's a bit like sitcoms in the 70s, what do you do with them? Oh, we take them on holiday. And I don't know whether this is one of the aspects of it which I find less winning. But because I think it could easily live without the trip to Amsterdam and Edinburgh. And what we've sacrificed is some of the other favourite characters. So Big L and Little Norm, for example, don't appear in it. I think they initially did in the script and they do in the novel version, but they've been cut out. So would I have rather have had them than the canal side scenes? Yes, I think I would have done. But also I think the fact that it's now 2 feature-length episodes, and I think Plater talked about this, means that you have 2 rather large dollops if you're watching it as broadcast anyway of, an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes if you take out the adverts, which, although feature-length and that's fine, maybe it is a little bit too leisurely for that. And so Plater did talk about how his material was better served in small portions. But of course, it does mean that the viewer isn't forgetting aspects of the plot, which is a danger when watching the first one, that you have a reset if you're watching it on a weekly basis and forgetting what's actually happened. So there are some benefits, I think, for it. And it has all these noir tropes again. We've got the shady surveillance going on and so forth. But that thin man aspect, which you've mentioned, I'd like to pick up on that, because that this comparison has been made. So Plater himself seeded that by that reference in in Get Lost to the Thin Man. But the baby element is interesting because, of course, this does culminate in the revelation of Jill's pregnancy, and that will, of course, be a trailer for the final one. Trevor and Jill, they have their own sort of language, their own rhythm, which is identifiably theirs, but they also have these insecurities as well. And as we've seen, they're tested, and they have a tiff. In the first series, they have a tiff about 2 episodes in, and they sort of don't speak to each other, but at the same time, they're adult and pragmatic, and they just continue. And they have this sort of like meta argument where they're sort of conveying their opinions to each other. And they say it's very, very kind of dry and laconic. And of course, the impediment here, which I find a stretch too far, is when, I think he's called Peterson, which I assume is a jazz reference. One of the...
Oscar Peterson.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, James.
Yeah. Yeah, so he appears on the ferry over to Amsterdam and declares this is the guy who's been initially rather intimidating, threatening guy who's arrived on their doorstep with a load of goons and guns. Later declares his love for Jill on the ferry while Trevor is having a conversation with a jazz musician who just happens to have washed up there. For me, this is a step too far. I don't know what you think. I found
Really?
Plato has to strike a balance between these kind of surrealistic turns of events or responses to things. And I think this was just, for me, the moment when the bubble was punctured a little bit and I lost a little bit of patience with it.
On the one hand, I understand what you're saying. I mean, it seems to me that in every one of the Beiderbecke stories, someone falls in love with Jill. And that's as it should be, because it's Barbara Flynn. So, of course, you're going to fall in love with her. I've been mad about her since A Very Peculiar Practice, and I've never been the same man since. Fantastic actress. She's wonderful in these things. So, in a way, she does it beautifully. I know what you mean. Obviously, partly it's the compression. I think if you had the 6 episodes and you spread it out and more things happened and you didn't feel so many things were on top of each other, then perhaps it wouldn't, even if they had the trips overseas, but it was across the 6 episodes so that you spend more time at home before you head off. Instead, it takes up a huge amount of the running time and becomes a selling point because, like I say, it's kind of like the Are You Being Served off to the Costa Blanca. I mean, that's what they did with every single sitcom that got turned into a movie in the 70s. They would usually get sent somewhere far away. You know, it's the standard thing to do, and it's tedious. Here, partly what I like about it is it does mean that you get the scene when Trev knocks Peterson out. Again, it's that sense of slight development in the persona. In the first one, at the end of it, we see Trev get a little bit hot under the collar in a sense that he realized that he isn't casual about everything and these things do matter. And therefore, he can actually tell somebody off and mean it. He says, don't mess with me. There's an element of that. Here, you know, we've introduced this character who is violent and seemingly nasty and part of the secret state. And he sort of has a pop at him, which is sort of important. The whole thing is deflated. I think what I enjoy about the plot of Tapes is, in some ways, the resolution of the plot is almost my favorite. The thing that it was all fake anyway. I think that's marvelous and I think works very well. And in a way, of the 3 of them, is the one that suits the kind of satirical tone even better. But also because, of course, it's double-edged. It wasn't true, but the whole point was, because then Jill says it, says, yeah, because they're going to do something equally nasty. It just isn't going to be here. It's going to be 10 miles up the road or something. It's going to be somewhere else, which, of course, is something that in political discourse and in political PR we've gotten very used to. You release something, everybody gets set up about it, you diffuse that, and you do something 10% less awful. Everybody says, well, at least it's not as bad as that thing, except it's pure strategy and doesn't mean anything. I know what you're getting at. I think what we're really talking about is, to a certain extent, the broadening of the comedy. Certainly, I think in the Scottish scenes, where we get the big fight scene and all that aspect of it, it's thoroughly entertaining, but I suppose it does feel more overtly comic. And one of the important things about Beiderbecke, surely, I think, is that in its gentle way, it has a kind of sort of plausibility, partly because it's not over-egged, because it is quite mild, I think. So I connect with all of that. I think having the baby at the end, it's again Plato showing that how on the ball he is about some of these things, which is that the way that it continues to define their relationship more strongly. You know, it brings them closer together because that is there in each one of the serials. And here it's sort of defined by that aspect of it. And I think that's important to have that. And so in that sense, it's Thin Man-ish. Of course, in the Thin Man, you're just enjoying their relationship. There's never any sense at all that they're in jeopardy as a couple. I don't think the Beiderbecke serials are really trying to ever suggest that. But at the same time, as I say, particularly in the first one, you get a sense of that there's things under there, because while there's that nice sort of cutting northern wit, dare I say, inverted commas, as someone who comes from Italy. But it seems to me that this whole kind of, she sort of loves him 50-50 sort of thing. 50-50, she's mad about him, 50-50 drives her mad sort of thing, which probably, let's face it, is a good definition of most marriages, I would have thought, if you're lucky.
Right. Yeah, no, I think, no, I think I'll...
You tell me, James, I'm a bachelor.
Oh, well, fair enough. I mean, I think you're right. But I think also, yes, the rampaging Scotsman who get them out of difficulty, it's fun. I mean, we could say that given the thematic emphasis upon disinformation, the fact that we have these exaggerated bits, we might kind of fold into that and acknowledge the artifice and the ridiculousness to see the truth beyond it, possibly, if we're going to take a sort of philosophical reading of it. But I suppose it's also, as you say, about that their relationship is tested, and the fact that this gives James Bolam a chance to be a bit more virile, quite frankly, because we have to buy the idea that he's got to become a father in the end of the episode, and so that brings out his maybe more caveman.
It's very simple. We just have to go to the pub every night until John turns up.
Is it compulsory?
Oh, come on. You're a hard-drinking macho Geordie.
Well, things change. Getting legless and puking behind people's hedges. Seems great when you're 19, but...
But you're seriously thinking of growing up into a mature human being?
Yes, a bit.
And you'll give up reading football annuals in bed?
Oh, come on. There are limits, you know.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about the tapes, and one of the things I like about it, is that they both have a sort of relationship with an older person who is sort of important to them in terms of what they've done with their life. So for Trevor, it's the jazz player who he meets, played by Victor Madden, who he meets on the ferry, but who just keeps saying bastard all the time because he's booked on the wrong flipping boat. And so he's in the wrong place and he's just annoyed about it, but they get completely hammered and have a nice chat. But for Jill, it's the Beryl Reid character. And of course, from a plot standpoint, she becomes crucial to the resolving of the plot because, you explain.
Well, yes. So Beryl Reid is, what is it which Jill calls her? The oldest suffragette in town, which she's either being ironic or she may well be so. But we've got the veteran television and film performer Beryl Reid here in a bit of a cameo, who is the person who Jill goes to with the aforementioned tapes. And after a bit of exploration, her character realizes that they are fake and that these tapes are very stagey and thus clearly some part of a disinformation tactic. So she's the one who brings that to the investigation. But no, I think you're totally right. It's the equivalent mentor figure, and to see both characters in that context gives that sense of, because we see them at school, less so in this one, but we don't get a sense of their broader networks. They feel as if their life is reduced to their own relationship and their working life. So it's nice to see that.
So then we move on to the third and final one. They're all released roughly within 3 years of each other. And so we've got the Beiderbecke Connection, which is a 4-part serial. So at least it gets proper room to breathe. And in fact, it feels like much closer to the first one than the second one, doesn't it? Just in terms of the cast of characters as well, because we've got Big Al and Little Dave, the policeman who's now got promoted and is in charge and has replaced Colin Blakely's character. So they're all back. You also get a slight sense of that the school is getting more and more run down, and so that critique of the cuts, which has been done in a kind of jokey way, sort of, Trevor sort of saying, well, we're only going to be able to build half a shelf or something because we haven't got the wood, these sorts of things in previous serials. Here now is kind of a real thing, and the resources aren't there, and there's this terrifying sequence when they go to the gym and it's literally going to fall down any second, which is sort of really scary. And obviously that's, again, part of those more serious themes start to become a bit more, I think they're still funny, but they're more evident about what was really happening circa 1988.
Yeah, it's clear that Trevor's anger, because this is the angriest we see him, I think, when he confronts the head teacher who is doubting the provenance of all the necessary items that are being brought to the school by way of Big Al, presumably, and his network, the gym stuff, and so on. And he does a speech about how, well, okay, maybe it is knockoff, but I'd rather, it's far better that we prioritise the education of our children than worrying about the details of this. And I think that's Plater's anger coming through, really. There's a neat arc right back to Get Lost when you look at what the kids in the woodwork classes are doing. I think they begin you see them in Beiderbecke Affair doing massive, there's a bit of comedy because you see James Bowling getting out of a van with all these massive lamps, the legs of lamps, I forget what you call them. And in the second one, in Tapes, they're now just doing table lamps because they haven't got the wood. And I think in the last one, they're now doing bookends. So you can see.
Yeah.
So you see this.
So it's just a wooden L.
Yeah. That's right. And likewise, you've got the kids, the enterprising kids who are stealing copies of Tess of the D'Urbervilles to allow Jill to have her class on that. So there is that kind of shades of grey there, because Big Al and Little Norm have always occupied that slightly grey area, not quite the black economy, what they would call the white economy. And we see here the suggestion that actually, when necessary, we have to make these complex kind of moral decisions about what's best. So that does darken the tone, I think. The plot involves a seeming refugee who appears in the first episode. Big Al asks Trevor and Jill to look after Ivan, who doesn't speak much English, but does have apparently an interest in jazz, which automatically places him within this brotherhood of jazz fans. And of course, we've already established in this and across Plater's work that if you're a jazz fan, you are trustworthy and you have a common language. But in actual fact, Ivan turns out not to be that. We eventually realise that he is on the run. He is a kind of corporate bank robber who is being sheltered. This is an interesting kind of 80s thing, that he's not so much in it for the money, but he's in it for the game. It's another form of subversion, sedition, radicalism, as we've seen expressed in different ways by the characters so far. So he's part of this brotherhood of tricky, weird, strange people who are pursuing their passions and their interests, and then having the state apparatus coming to stamp them out. There's a complicated bit of plot in that he's been Ivan, or well, actually not Ivan, whatever his real name is, has been in prison with Jill's ex-husband Peter, which is kind of brings it closer to home. Meanwhile, you've got Hobson investigating this whole thing, up to his usual surveillance tricks, but at the end, you see Hobson changing as well, and there's an interesting arc with his character. He comes more to accept the perspective of Plater and Chaplin and Jill, I think. Certainly his storyline is, when you first see him, you're irritated by this aspirational corporate policeman. But as I've mentioned already, when he delivers this line about the impenetrable mystery of Yorkshire, there's something beyond his grasp. And for him, the revelation is there will always be something you can't predict. There is always a type of human behaviour and interaction which is beyond rational comprehension, which is something which, of course, Plater is celebrating here. So it's 4 episodes. Feels like a nice fitting wrap-up of the entire series. It's satisfying in the way that it brings all the characters back. Even Pitt, who is the guy we saw working for the
planning office, and here he made a sideways move. Yes.
And he ends up promoting his own jazz club. So.
Well, yes, I know, and he's going to use his redundancy more money for it, and he's going to keep him going for about 6 weeks. And there's this very delicate, poetic moment, isn't there, when he's sort of dancing on his own to the music in the rain, out, listening from outside the club, and sort of Jill sort of talks to him, and he sort of says, "No, for 6 weeks, this is totally worth it. This is my dream."
We must all find our fantasies the best way we can, Mrs. Swinburne. I shall have 6 weeks before the money runs out.
And then?
Who knows?
Another sideways career move?
I've always lived my life sideways, Mrs. Swinburne. It's the best way of avoiding what lies ahead.
It's a point of view. Thank you for letting me watch.
and it's a wonderful he's a lovely character. It's all very strange, and yes, and of course the band that's playing is the Frank Ricotti All Stars without Kenny Baker, who is the soloist, who's kind of doing the equivalent of the Big Spiderbeck playing on the soundtrack. We don't see him in the club. Kenny Baker, of course, is a big name. One of the slightly strange things about that serial is the plotting, partly because it's a four-parter and designed as a four-parter, I think. Plotting seems mostly firmer, if you like, which is either a good thing or a bad thing. You know, I think everything else, tonally, you're still there. I don't quite get the whole thing about Ivan leaving and coming back and crossing the border, because it's certainly never explained. It seems unnecessary. It's funny, but given that it turns out Ivan isn't a refugee and he's this criminal, and you don't know why they have to go and do this whole thing, and you either think, well, something happened and he just had to come back and, you know, mistakes were made and it just doesn't matter. But you don't quite get it, and there's no effort at all to explain the relationship with Big Al, is there? I mean, you know, you just assume it.
That's right. I think there are some leaps of imagination there. I know what you mean. Why does it keep on ping-ponging back, other than to provide some cliffhangers and some moments? Conceptually, I rather like it. I rather love the idea that, you know, he's trying to escape Yorkshire, and for whatever reason, there's this force field around it. And it also allows for this wonderfully grand vision of Yorkshire where you're going to the various borders and then waving people off, which is a wonderfully, again, it's going back to what Hobson's saying about the mystery of Yorkshire, the fact that he's trying to escape but keeps on being impelled back. So I quite like it on a sort of topographical, conceptual level, but on a narrative level, you're totally right. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
On the other hand, that what you talked about there about the darkness, of course. I mean, there's that scene when they finally do leave on this boat, and she says to Ivan, you know, you're going to have to get rid of my husband as well, my ex-husband as well. Because, of course, the ex-husband turning up is the equivalent of having the ex-fiance of Trev's turning up, and serves kind of the same function, which is that it's the domestic side of the serial. It's where are they in their relationship? Because by this point, Trevor is looking after their son, who they've decided to call Firstborn until they come up with a better name. I can't believe they haven't called him Bix, but nonetheless. And it's all funny stuff, you know. He does the classic, you know, he's reading Dr. Spock and makes a funny joke about, you know, how did he get pointy ears, all that kind of stuff, and you get nice references to them still having a sex life. Yay. On the other hand, and it's useful because I think that then you get that quite important sequence where she sort of, it's an interesting moment. If you're a fan of the Maltese Falcon, one of the most important bits in the Maltese Falcon, right at the end, is when Sam Spade tries to explain to Bridget O'Shaughnessy kind of what his code is, what keeps him going, even though he's going to sell her out to the cops because, you know, she's a murderess and she deserves to go to jail, and he isn't going to be her fall guy.
You'll never understand me, but I'll try once and then give it up. When a man's partner's killed, he's supposed to do something about it. It doesn't make any difference what you thought of him. He was your partner, and you're supposed to do something about it. And it happens we're in the detective business. Well, when one of your organization gets killed, it's bad business to let the killer get away with it. Bad all around, bad for every detective everywhere.
Here, you get a sequence where Jill, speaking to her ex-husband, who's sort of saying, what do you see in Trevor? And she sort of, for the first time, gives a real answer. And it's also it's a confirmation. It's not speculative. It's not kind of, well, it's sort of, I feel like, no, it's just, no, you know, this is why he's important to me, and this is why he's so special in his own way.
I'll tell you the big secret. You won't know what the hell I'm talking about, but I'll tell you. I like to watch crappy old black and white movies on the telly. Trevor doesn't. So he'll read a football annual, or sit with the headphones on listening to Bix or Duke or Bird.
Bird?
Charlie Parker. Don't you know anything?
Go on. You're watching a crappy old movie?
Well, some of them make me cry. When the dog doesn't come home, or the hero walks into the sea, or the telegram arrives and the woman says to the telegram boy, I'm sorry, there's no answer. At that moment, I reach out and Trevor is already handing me a Kleenex. He knows 5 seconds ahead of the moment when I need to cry. That, I have to tell you, is the most precious gift known to humanity.
Now, Trevor happens to hear it because he's on the stairs. And, of course, he then says to her after as well, I did hear what you said, but she didn't know that at the time. And it's very typical and very beguiling, that sense of total honesty, of that total openness. But you do get these darker moments, like, is this Ivan guy going to kill off her ex-husband? Or presumably will just dump him somewhere because he's surplus to requirements after a certain point. And so he'll have to make his own way. That is in there, in the serial. It has this great sense of humour, these wonderfully daft ideas, the great dialogue, but these darker elements are there. And yet you're emphasising and what it is that people do to survive. Even the policeman in the end has to get a little bit tough with his 2 Miami Vice cop wannabes subordinates who are taking the mickey the whole time and are very funny. But in actual fact, in the end, he sort of says, straighten up. I do know what you're up to.
And I really like that moment, actually. I warmed to him across the whole arc of the series. But what you were describing there in terms of what Jill says about Trevor without her realising he's listening, I suppose is kind of the conclusion and where we're heading rather than the revelation of plot. I think the plot here it is less interesting, and I think by this stage we've sort of forgotten all about Ivan and as you say, those some plot holes in the early stages of the story. Where we actually end now, Plato is often quite self-conscious about the difficulty of ending. You have Going Back to Get Lost, where the characters actually discuss how we're going to end this finale, and you do have the equivalent in the Beiderbecke, where whether they run down a hill in slow motion or drive off into the sunset. And you on the one hand, you could say this is a little bit lazy because how would you tie it up? How would you tie it up other than this sort of meta ending? But I think it is sweet here at the end when we get, I think we've mentioned this a few times, but the idea of listening to the music, which is a certain repetitious thing in Plato's work. I think you get this in the Barchester. I don't know where its first appearance is in Plato's work. I'm pretty sure in Barchester it appears in some form about whether you can hear the music of the Donald Pleasant's character who plays the cello, and Alan Rickman's character is immune to the music and says something he doesn't like music. So it crops up in the oddest places, not always to do with jazz, but it gets its most kind of profound iteration here when Trevor says to Hobson, there's 2 kinds of people in the world: those who hear the music and those who don't. And it ends with Trevor saying to Jill, "Well, how do we in a world like this, what do we do?" And the only answer is, well, we can only listen to the music. And I suppose what is the music? And I think as we've been talking about, I'm interpreting that as not just literally jazz, but that music of radicalism, subversion, challenge, which is everything that both he and Jill represent, that Big Al and Little Norm represents. Even corporate robber Ivan, in his own way, is part of this challenge to state apparatus. I mean, what do you think it means?
I see it that way as well, in the sense that the idea of listen to the music is the idea that you're being literally and figuratively tuned in to something and being able to actually make time to listen, but also to be able to feel what it conveys, because it can bring a sense of emotion, but it can also give you a sense of moral direction. It's right or wrong in the implications of what you're saying about how do you deal with these corporate interests that don't care about people but only care about profit. In an era of, this is the height of Thatcher's Britain. It's the 80s. And yet here you have 3 serials that are celebrating something incredibly down to earth, and yet they're not going to be, they hope, downtrodden. The terrible things happen to them, things get destroyed, and it's this kind of, okay, we'll build it again. And that's a philosophy. It's being able to listen to the siren call of your better nature, it seems to me, and that's what it's getting at. And that's, Bix Beiderbecke is this, he's someone who had a very short life and who wasn't famous in his own lifetime. He was only known to other jazz players. He was a little unusual because he was surrounded by black jazz players, and he was the only sort of white jazz player of that type, of that caliber. And what you're saying is that this is someone who stood out a little bit, but who was part of something bigger than himself. And that's what it's drawing to. And I think it's not very hard to see how this is part of a very British coup, which of course doesn't end well. It's all about an extremely sort of left-wing British government that ultimately gets duffed up. Equally, in something like Fortunes of War, which he was doing in the middle of all of this, one of the great things about that is that this is the BBC's big budget response to ITV's successes with heritage TV productions on a grand scale, The Jewel and the Crown and the aforementioned Brideshead. But one of the things that's great about it is, of course, is that the lead character played by Kenneth Branagh isn't just a liberal. He's basically a communist, and he's kind of the hero of the show. And this is completely unapologetic. That's fabulous. Good luck doing that now. I think that's brilliant. And, even when you get to some later Plater works, like Last of the Blonde Bombshells, once again, you're introducing potentially interesting, radical little elements and lots of great music, fantastic cast, and it's a very gentle kind of play. But, he was still able to get things like that made. He did an interesting play with James Bolam for technically daytime viewing. I can't remember if it's an adaptation of his radio play or is it the other way around, but I know it exists in two versions. And yeah, when he's doing Lewis, I mean, one of the great lines he wrote for Lewis, which I know he used in his private life, was, it's either the first or the second episode he wrote for Lewis, where you've got this writer from up north who's come down to Oxford, and you get Lewis, who of course is a Geordie, and he gets to say how pissed off he is about, well, he's not the one saying it, but they're talking about how much they dislike professional northerners.
Yeah.
And that's such a classic Plater line. So that, that personality and that personal aspect to the writing is still coming through. And of course, because he had this relationship, he became kind of the favorite writer on the Lewis series. So, each series had 4 feature-length stories, and for 4 years running, Plater wrote one of them. And no other writer wrote as many during that period. And he has this good relationship with Kevin Whately, so that his last produced play for television is Joe Madison's War, and Whately stars in it, and then Plater passes away the year that it was broadcast. So although he had his difficulties, although things often didn't go right, I like to think that in his own way, I think that everything he's talking about in the Beiderbecks, about listening to the music, basically bore fruit, even with all the kind of mini disasters that he did suffer in the 90s and things like that didn't go right, and shows that were taken out of his hands and they cast the wrong person and they used the wrong locations and completely went against everything that he suggested, and they just didn't care. So he ended up writing more episodes of, DL and Pasco or what have you, which are all good, though. They're always good. Anyway, that's my take.
That was a wonderful summary of the next 20, 30 years of Plater's career, which, as you said, it's very easy to dismiss, the work he did for Midsummer Murders or Lewis as, being hack work, but far from it. He is sneaking into those some quite personal preoccupations. And yeah, I think that's actually the Lewis episode which you mentioned there. I forget what it's called, Old School Ties.
I think that's right, yeah.
The first one. Yes, that's wonderfully knowing. And actually, a mention there of Kevin Whately reminds me that there is this sort of Plater coterie repertory company, and of course this is one of the sort of the pleasures that you get certainly in Beiderbecke. There's actors who he's worked with before and then we'll go on to later, who obviously understand his rhythms. I mean, you mentioned there's some disappointments. I think there's one show which I want to mention, because I probably was his last attempt to do a Beiderbecke, which you were kind of alluding to, and there's some good examples there, which is Oliver's Travels from the mid-1990s, which was, I think it ended up as a 5-part, but it was so compromised and convoluted in its production history. This is the famous show. This Oliver's Travels stars Alan Bates, which itself was problematic according to Plater, but we'll get to that in a second, as an academic in a Welsh university who is fired, and he's also a little bit like Trevor Chaplin's jazz fixation, is obsessed with crosswords and word puzzles and so forth. And he detects some sort of a clue in a crossword compiler column, and then he goes across a cross-country quest which takes him from Wales right up through the UK, through the north of England, right up to Orkney eventually. All places which are very meaningful to Plato in different ways, because he has all sorts of connections, different places in the country. And along the way, they uncover some sort of, again, there's MacGuffins there about conspiracy theory, some sort of corporate company, and there's all murder and shenanigans. But you don't kind of remember the plot. It's really about, as the title suggests, this traversing across the country, meeting different people and seeing the landscape change. Now, for Plato, this was compromised. He went very public over what he thought the BBC got wrong with it. It was actually based on a novel, so it was a situation where he told people quite publicly to read the novel. It's better. What his major issue was Tom Courtenay, who his friend, I think it was the year above him or below him at school, I can't quite remember, back in Hull, was Tom Courtenay, the actor who came to prominence in the 60s in the British New Wave film, Billy Liar and all of that. And he was originally lined up to be the main character, which eventually went to Alan Bates.
Pretty much just because they thought Bates was the better known name, right?
Yeah, I mean...
but they're not exactly interchangeable actors. It's a very different kind of actor.
But Plato had all kinds of trouble. He felt that there were problems with the accents of some of the characters, some of the geographical realities, and the general tone. He didn't like and in terms of the music, significant, because the score by Carl Davis, and it's perfectly serviceable, but Plato didn't hear the music in it, clearly. I don't know whether he wanted it to be more jazzy, but he found that unacceptable. So Plato went very public. He wrote articles for The Guardian and spoke to journalists about how terrible it was and how let down he'd been, which was the sort of thing you can do at that point in your career, but clearly probably didn't win him many favours. I quite like Oliver's Travels because I feel he's quite harsh with it. It's more Plato, and the opportunities for him to create this kind of work were few and far between at this point. 5 or 6 part series in which he's indulging his various obsessions and interests. I mean, it's not Beiderbecke, but it's all right, you know. It's a bit like what, I don't know, Dennis Potter's Karaoke and Cold Lazarus is to the Singing Detective. It's more Dennis Potter. It's more Alan Plato. I mean, we should be grateful that it exists. But actually, speaking of the Potter, that's interesting because it's probably at that moment, because Potter must be dying around this time, so 94, 95.
Something, yes, that sounds about right.
Feels like the end of an era for a certain generation of sort of British auteurs, Plato among them. But as you've said elsewhere, of course, he's not just working for television, he's writing for film. Blonde Bombshells, Last of the Blonde Bombshells with Judi Dench, ended up as a TV film, may have and been initially a cinema work. I think had a convoluted history. That also went through various compromises. But he's also doing sterling work for theatre, regional theatre. In my neck of the woods, up in Newcastle upon Tyne, in the northeast of England, he established a strong relationship with a renowned local theatre called Live Theatre, and he wrote a number of plays, which I saw back in the 90s and 2000s and onwards. He wrote one starring Tim Healy, for example, called Looking for Buddy, in which Tim Healy, the Auf Wiedersehen pet actor, plays this is going to sound familiar, a jazz-loving private eye type figure who's exploring noirish Tyneside, looking for a particular mysterious jazz record. Okay, you could see that he was recycling some old ideas. But in other words, he was finding ways to indulge his passions and drives, albeit just not on sort of mainstream serial television. And as you say, we've got the episodes of Lewis and even Dale and Pascoe and other things to cherish as part of that legacy.
Weirdly, I think, going back to the first memories I have of his work, actually, one of the other things I remember seeing in the late 70s was Flambards, which, I've never been able to even forget the theme tune of that. I think he wrote most of that, but he was, I think, the main. So, a very different kind of work, and I think that's the amazing side of his career. I think it's so varied, and it's a shame we didn't get more, but we got so much that it seems churlish to complain.
It is, and there were failed experiments, but there were bold experiments. There was a show he did at the end of the 80s, which he would have been working on around the same time as Connection, which was called Tales from Sherwood Forest, which is a real oddity, and it occasionally crops up on YouTube, but has otherwise fallen into a bit of a black hole. Not without reason, because it's not particularly good. But it was a ITV series in which Plato wrote essentially the Bible, the playbook, the characters, and the first episode, then handed over the rest of the series to new writers. And so the idea was that he would set this thing going and play his civic duty as a renowned writer. So it is madly uneven and rather maddening. But it stars Pete Postlethwaite as a university lecturer. Quite a lot of failed university lecturers in Plato's work. Probably maybe something to do with his own university experience of dropping out of his architecture degree, maybe. And I think a lot of his family were teachers as well. So you get a lot of teachers, academic feel his work. Anyway, Tales from Sherwood Forest. Pete Postlethwaite is a sacked university lecturer, polytechnic lecturer, who I think uses his redundancy money to follow his dream of opening a Casablanca-themed bar in Nottingham, which he calls Rick's Bar. And thus we have the pretext for all kinds of noirish adventures. And the whole thing was shot in the studio. And this was a deliberate choice. It was a kind of an attempt to, I mean, when you think about the timing, 1989 for that, it seemed...
one of the last, really.
Unusual. Yeah. And it also has musical sequences, post-Potter musical sequences, sort of fantasy sequences, song and dance, very much under the shadow of what Potter was doing. The characters do break into song and what have you. The whole thing is bonkers and vastly uneven, but he gave it a go. And, that's something to be cherished, just the sheer adventure. I mean, what I've described there sounds probably more interesting than it actually is. It's a bit of a chore to get through, but you like the fact that he's saying yes to that. So yes, he is doing Fortunes of War and the big heritage stuff, and he is doing the literary classics and Beiderbecke, but he's also exploring these other curious things as well. Some of his own more personal work is very music themed. So I don't know whether you know Mysterioso, which was initially a book. That was early 90s. That became a one-off drama. That's terrific, about a young woman meeting up with her father, who runs a jazz club. It's a massively impressive career. But even though there is this golden thread through it in many ways, particularly his socialist principles shine through, his playful attitude toward genre, obviously his musical obsessions, which become clearer as he goes on. It's quite an achievement.
So when is the book out?
So I am writing a book at the minute on Plato's writing, and because I'm still writing it, and because academic publishing doesn't always go at a rate of knots, I can't tell you directly, but I'd like to think it'll be out certainly in either late 2026 or 2027. But watch this space. I've had an absolute blast. And one thing we haven't talked about in great detail are his Z-Cars and Softly episodes. But I've been having a lot of fun watching them recently, and also looking at the scripts of many of the episodes which have been wiped. So I feel fully immersed in the Platoverse right now.
Sounds like a great place to be, James. If you were going to recommend something other than Plato's work to listeners of Tipping My Fedora, is there something you would recommend? Because if not, I'm going to recommend something to you.
I began this conversation earlier by talking about the things which got me intrigued by film noir, and I talked about spoofs and comedies and so forth. And I know Who Framed Roger Rabbit is definitely one which has been covered on your podcast and been much discussed already by, I think Simon talked about that. I think
Simon Brown, yeah, our friend, yes.
I did drop in this reference to the Steve Martin film, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, which I'm going to recommend it to myself, because in the course of this conversation, I've realised that I don't think I've looked at that film for 40 years. No,
right. Okay.
30 years at least. And I'd like to know whether my 10-year-old self was right in thinking that this was the funniest film ever made, or whether time has been less kind on it. Have you seen that?
I'm a little bit older than you, James. I saw it when it came out of the cinema, and loved it. And by that point, I was a film buff. I would have been 14 when it came out. And I was picking up all the references. I kind of knew where all the clips are coming from. So that was great. But it's one of those films that in the family, it's become a bit of a joke. So it's kind of like the line, "This is never going to heal," gets used a lot because of the fact that the hero in that film keeps getting shot in exactly the same spot in the arm. And it's very funny. And, Rachel Ward has to come and suck the bullet out. And she sort of sucks away at his arm to get the bullet out, which is very funny. And no, I love that film. It's so daft. And also it has that advantage that it was made when a lot of the people who had been involved in making classic era film noir were still around.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of them contributed, of course. The costume designer, Edith Head, the composer, Miklos Roja, who had written the music for most of the films whose clips are probably being used in that film. Well, not most, but a lot of them. So that's kind of fantastic. He got to sort of write the score for films that using clips from 40 years earlier that he'd written in the first place. And I think it's deliriously funny.
Steve Martin, Am, Rigby Reardon in Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid.
Will $200 be enough in advance, Mr. Reardon?
200, I'd shoot my grandmother. No criminal is too tough for him. No pain is too great.
Where'd you learn that?
At camp.
No joke, too disgusting.
Do I look like a dame?
Not as much as I do.
I haven't turned on a charm yet.
He'll laugh in the face of danger. He'll dace in
a lot of the titles you're mentioning, the Plater titles, aren't as easy to get as they might be. I mean, even the Beiderbecke trilogies, they all seem to be, shall we say, variously available on the likes of YouTube. I don't know how legal any of that is, because they were out on a DVD set from Network. I've got that. It's a marvelous set, but Network went bankrupt, and I don't think anybody's taken that one up. So you can't just go out and buy it new. You'd have to get hold of the pre-existing set. Things like Oliver's Travels or Misterioso, I don't think they're lying around, are they?
No, not at all. Oliver's Travels, I think right now is on YouTube. But as you say, they can easily come up and down. I mean, Beiderbecke is usually on YouTube somewhere because I think it has a certain traction, a fan following for it. Mm. And it did get a repeat, I think. I don't know if it's still there on the ITV X. But it has certain reputational implications, of course, if things do disappear, and I think that is significant. A lot of Plater's work, I mean, Misterioso, for example, which is terrific and has a certain cult reputation, is pretty impossible to find. A lot of these are on Boxer Broadcasts, for example, for those in the UK educational community, thanks to the diligent work of those who've helped to put them up there. But otherwise, you're going to be struggling to find them.
You're a lecturer. What do your students think about stuff from the 70s and 80s? Are they aware of it, or is this just this old stuff that's usually very slow and they'd rather be watching something a bit more fast-paced?
What do they think about stuff from the 90s and early 2000s might be an equivalent question.
Yeah.
Oh, I wouldn't dare to answer that. I think, or to indeed what the young folk are into these days. But I think anything with a genre connection, of course, does likely encourage a curious and interested audience. And I think we've probably got more chance of our young folk, he says rather patronizingly, exploring the history of detective noir, or indeed like they are with horror, and looking back at sort of, important and influential films that are part of a lineage. In this age of, Spotify and everything being available, that's hard to we have to rewind a bit and think what it was like 40 years ago, that if you wanted to get some jazz records, you might have to go to London to Mole Jazz Records. There is a Mole Jazz bag which appears in one of the episodes. Plater clearly insisted on. You have to find your tribe. You have to go to the jazz club. You have to do all of that. I mean, it's a plot device. It's all obviously a MacGuffin to get it all going. But there is something about the kind of materiality and tangibility of that. Trevor's passions are on a shelf. This is my collection of tapes and records, and let me talk to you about them. And this is how I identify myself. Which in the digital age, it's quite tempting to see that analog fixation as rather sweet.
Well, I mean, look, at least it's like those copies of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I mean, Kindle hasn't stopped books actually being printed. Quite the opposite. Still doing well, because it turns out you can't give them to people as presents otherwise.
True. But we should all give people copies of Beiderbecke as presents, whether it's the novel or whether it's the DVD. As you say, since Network went kaput, I suspect there are copies circling around in the usual places. But the Network set is beautiful. I thoroughly recommend it. It's got wonderful notes by Andrew Pixley. It has all kinds of extras and interviews, and the shows themselves looking splendid.
On that note, James, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and I really hope we can get you back for either Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid or Night Moves, or both. And in the meantime, good luck with the book.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Take care.
Take care, mate.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.